Loved what you saw? Smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notified every time we post a new video. Dallas/Fort Worth Airport, Texas, August 30th, 1988. A Delta Airlines Boeing 727-200 passenger aircraft is preparing to operate Flight 1141 from Dallas to Salt Lake City. On board are 108 people, 101 passengers, and 7 crew members. A very experienced crew is preparing to pilot the aircraft. The left seat is occupied by 48-year-old Captain Larry Davis, a Vietnam veteran with over 17,000 flight hours. The right seat is occupied by 37-year-old First Officer Kerry Kirk with 6,500 flight hours, and the flight engineer's station is occupied by 40-year-old Stephen Chang, who has flown over 4,500 hours. All three are professionals who know their Boeing 727 aircraft inside and out. It is one of the most popular airliners of its time. Its distinguishing feature is 3 engines in the tail section and a T-tail. But it had another peculiarity. Operating such a complex aircraft requires a crew of 3. The captain and first officer manage the flight, while the flight engineer is responsible for the aircraft systems. The effectiveness of their work depends directly on coordination and discipline. Passenger boarding proceeds normally. The flight engineer conducts a walk-around inspection of the aircraft, and the pilots prepare for startup. A maintenance mechanic, after boarding the liner and examining its flight log, sees an entry about a faulty fuel gauge. But, according to the minimum equipment list issued by Delta Airlines, operating the aircraft with such a malfunction is permitted. The flight is preparing for departure on schedule at 8:30 a.m. Central Time. However, due to high congestion at the Dallas airport and waiting for takeoff clearance, the flight is delayed. The aircraft pushes back from the gate but is forced to wait in line at the departure end.
This is 1141 on the taxiway, requesting takeoff clearance. This is 1141. Takeoff clearance denied. Hold on the taxiway. I hope we're not waiting here until retirement. That's for sure. We should shut down the 3rd engine. We'll save a few $1,000s.
Since the wait could last several tens of minutes, the pilots shut down one of the 3 engines to save fuel. A delay at one of the busiest airports in the U.S. is a common occurrence to let preceding flights pass. Gentlemen, how are you doing? Senior Flight Attendant Deke Sedan enters the cockpit. Waiting for clearance. We'll let other planes take off. I heard that soon these tape recorders will be recording everything. Yes, they are constantly recording, and they have a recording of everything that happened with the other guys. Well, what else should we talk about? We can discuss the personal lives of the stewardesses. Our conversation is being monitored, if we get into trouble. At this time, in the cockpit, where maximum concentration should prevail, a casual conversation strikes up. The crew jokes, discusses the recent Continental Airlines crash in Denver, personal lives, and even President Reagan. It was ordinary colleague chatter, but it was happening at the most inopportune moment. In aviation, there is a rule known as the, quote, sterile cockpit rule. This rule, introduced in the U.S. in 1980, strictly prohibits pilots from engaging in any conversation not related to flight operations during all critical phases of flight. This includes during taxi, takeoff, ascent up to 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters, as well as during descent and landing. The goal is simple: to ensure the crew's maximum concentration on controlling the aircraft when the risk of an abnormal situation is highest. Finally, at 9 a.m., 1141 receives takeoff clearance.
This is 1141. Wind 090 at 5 knots. Runway 18 left. Cleared for takeoff. 1141. Cleared for takeoff.
While taxiing onto the runway, the flight engineer hastily restarts the 3rd engine. Engrossed in conversation, the pilots of Flight 1141 skip the most crucial stage of pre-takeoff preparation. They do not perform the checklist, the pre-flight check. Captain Davis moves the thrust levers to the takeoff position. The powerful Pratt & Whitney engines roar, and the aircraft begins its takeoff roll. The aircraft speeds down the runway of the Dallas airport, and the first officer, as required, calls out the speed, 80 knots, V1. This is the decision speed, after which the takeoff cannot be aborted. Rotate. The captain pulls back on the control column. The aircraft's nose obediently rises. but the liner does not behave as it should. It lifts off the ground reluctantly, struggling to gain altitude. At that moment, a deafening, intermittent sound erupts in the cockpit. The stall warning system activates. This is the stick shaker, a mechanism that begins to violently shake the pilots, control columns, signaling that the aircraft is on the verge of losing lift. What happened? We have an engine failure. The pilots think an engine has failed, but just as the liner lifts off the runway, there are suddenly what sound like two explosions, after which the aircraft jerks, as if the engines had gone into reverse thrust. Then the Boeing 727 begins to enter an uncontrolled right bank, and the pilots can do nothing about it. According to the air traffic controllers in the tower, who watched the takeoff, Flight 1141 was taking off at a steep angle of attack. In what position were the flaps at the time of takeoff? None of the ground witnesses could recall. A passenger sitting by the window notices that on the left wing, its trailing edge was not a straight line, from which he concludes that the flaps were somewhat retracted. The pilots pull back on the control column, but the aircraft continues to fall. The wings rock from side to side, after which the descending liner disappears in a cloud of dust. Just 22 seconds after lifting off the ground, 900 meters from the end of the runway, the Boeing 727 crashed to the ground. The impact was terrible. The fuselage broke into 3 parts and immediately burst into flames, fueled by tons of aviation kerosene. 14 people die in the crash, including senior flight attendant D.K. Sedan. 94 people, including the pilots, survive, having sustained injuries of varying severity. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, immediately arrive at the scene. The initial theories were obvious: engine failure, sudden wind shear, or pilot error. Examination of the engines showed that all 3 were operating at takeoff power until the moment of impact with the ground. The engine failure theory was dismissed. Weather data also did not indicate the presence of dangerous wind shear. The investigators' attention focused on the aircraft's condition and the crew's actions. A key piece of evidence was found during the inspection of the wing wreckage. Based on the position of the jack screws, the mechanisms that physically extend and retract the flaps, investigators were able to unequivocally determine that at the moment of takeoff, they were in the 0 or fully retracted position. This discovery was shocking. How could 3 experienced pilots make such an elementary mistake? The black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder were supposed to provide the answer. The flight data recorder confirmed the terrible suspicion. It recorded that the speed was sufficient for takeoff, with flaps extended but insufficient for takeoff on a clean wing. The aircraft was doomed from the very start of its takeoff roll. But the main question remained: why? Boeing 727 aircraft are equipped with a takeoff warning system, TOWS. This is an audible alarm that should have sounded if the pilots attempted to take off with the flaps retracted, the parking brake activated, or the spoilers not deployed. Why then was there silence in the cockpit of Flight 1141? And here, investigators discovered a fatal combination of circumstances and a flaw in the system's design. The takeoff configuration warning on the 727 activates only when the engine thrust levers are moved forward from the idle position. The crew of Flight 1141, while waiting for takeoff, had not fully pulled the thrust levers back to idle. They kept them in a slightly more advanced position for taxiing. Because of this, when they began the takeoff, the system did not receive the necessary signal to activate and check the configuration. It simply did not go off. But the main cause lay not in the technology, but in the people. Listening to the cockpit voice recorder tape put everything in its place. The extraneous conversation with the flight attendant, jokes, and distracting topics completely destroyed the standard preparation procedure. The crew simply forgot to perform the takeoff checklist. They were so relaxed and distracted that they missed a fundamental action that each of them had performed thousands of times. The final investigation report was published on September 26, 1989. According to the report, one of the main causes of the Flight 1141 crash was the lack of discipline by the captain and first officer, who allowed the airliner to take off with the flaps and slats not set to the required position. Another cause of the disaster was the failure of the aircraft's takeoff warning system, which failed to warn the pilots of their error. A contributing factor in the crash was shortcomings within Delta Air Lines itself, which had significantly delayed implementing necessary changes to manuals, checklist procedures, and crew training and checking methods. This was largely due to significant changes that occurred after the airline's rapid growth and various mergers. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, was also criticized for not taking sufficiently aggressive measures to force Delta Airlines to correct these deficiencies, and inspector checks were conducted without the necessary diligence. Following this incident, the FAA and airlines worldwide once again tightened control over compliance with the sterile cockpit rule. Checklist execution procedures were reviewed and improved. Aircraft manufacturers, in turn, made changes to the logic of warning systems to eliminate such blind spots. This disaster also gave rise to the concept of crew resource management, CRM. This philosophy teaches pilots effective interaction, cross-checking, and encourages any crew member, regardless of rank, to point out errors made by senior-ranking members. If the flight engineer or first officer of Flight 1141 had insisted on performing the checklist, the tragedy could have been avoided. Ultimately, Captain Larry Davis and First Officer Kerry Kirk had their pilot licenses revoked, and they were also fired from Delta Airlines for the deaths of 14 people. No one went to prison. What do you think, friends? Be sure to share your opinion in the comments. Until next time.